I was never one to keep count of sacrifices. Motherhood to me was not a balance sheet. You give, and then you give some more, hoping somewhere down the line. Love is enough to fill in the spaces where gratitude might never be spoken. I raised my son alone after his father passed away unexpectedly when Tam was just 7. In a small village like ours, where the winds carry gossip faster than the harvest dries under the sun. I fought battles in silence, behind closed doors, and with an apron tied around my waist. I was a schoolteacher for 34 years, taught 3 generations of children in that creaky classroom with the uneven floorboards and the blackboard that never stopped squeaking. It was never much, but it was honest work, and when I retired, I did so with a modest pension and a back curved like a question mark. After retiring, I moved in with my son and his boy, my only grandson. Tam had fallen on hard times. His marriage crumbled, jobs came and went like seasons that never stayed long enough to nourish anything. I never asked questions. I simply cooked, cleaned, mended, and used my pension to pay for groceries, electricity, clothes, and sometimes even school supplies. Every month, when the small pension payment came in a yellowed envelope, I handed it to my son without hesitation. He never asked, I never withheld. The house we shared wasn't big nor beautiful. It had concrete walls painted in flaking blue, a roof patched with mismatched tiles, and a small courtyard that turned into a shallow pond when it rained. But it was ours, or rather his. I didn't care. My room was little more than a corner with a bed, a stool, and a window that overlooked the neighbor's chicken coop. I cherished the early mornings, when the birds called out before the roosters, and the dew hung on the banana leaves like tears refusing to fall. I would sweep the yard, prepare breakfast, fold tiny socks, and write in my notebook with the crooked handwriting arthritis had forced on me. Years passed. My pension, though meager, became the unseen glue that held this fragile household together. And then, as naturally as the sun sets a little earlier in winter, the envelope stopped arriving. The government's new policy, they said, had restructured the payment cycles, and at my age, I no longer qualified. There was no warning, no courtesy note, just absence, and with that absence came a silence in the house that grew louder each day. Tam changed. At first it was subtle. He became distant, moody. Then the complaints started, why there was never enough food, why the electricity bill was too high, why his shirt wasn't ironed. His voice, once indifferent, took on an edge sharp enough to slice through my remaining peace. I still did everything. Rose before dawn, swept the yard, cared for the child, cleaned the bathroom floor on my knees. I even sold vegetables behind the market temple for a few coins, just enough to buy some eggs or a bag of rice. But nothing I did seemed to matter anymore. I had become invisible in the very home I had helped build, a ghost in her own grave, waiting for the last shovel of dirt. He never raised a hand before, not once. But anger has a way of fermenting in silence, and guilt can rot a man from the inside out. That night I remember the rain. It came in sideways sheets, pelting the rooftop like curses. The kitchen light flickered as if warning me. I had forgot to add fish sauce to the stew, and he found it bland. His rage, like a storm finally released, erupted in the form of a blow that sent me to the floor. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I looked at the cracked tile an inch from my cheek and wondered how long that stain near the wall had been there. It was old, like me. When he left the room, slamming the door so hard the child started crying in the next room, I remained there on the cold floor for a while. Not because I was hurt, my bones had felt worse, but because I was measuring silence. A mother has a threshold. She can endure a lack of thanks, even a lack of affection. But cruelty, that is something else. That is the moment you realize your presence is no longer a comfort, but an inconvenience. I rose slowly, picked up the spoon I had dropped, and set it on the counter. My hand trembled as I wiped the edge clean with the hem of my blouse. I walked to my room and sat on the bed, listening to the sound of the rain muting everything else. My suitcase was under the bed, a relic from years past, used only for school trips or weddings. I pulled it out, wiped the dust off with the sleeve of my shirt, and packed it with a pair of pants, 2 old cardigans, a hairbrush with more gray than bristle, and my worn notebook. I didn't write a note. What could I possibly say that hadn't already been etched into the floorboards, the air, the routine of disappearing dignity? I waited until the moon was swallowed by clouds and the frogs had begun their midnight chorus. Then I left. I remember the heaviness of that air, as if the night itself were mourning. I walked past the sleeping houses, my rubber slippers sloshing through puddles, the hem of my dress soaked and clinging to my legs. I clutched my bag with one hand and held the umbrella with the other, though the wind made it nearly useless. No one saw me go, no one called after me. I didn't know where I was going, just that it had to be anywhere but there. I thought of the old temple on the hillside, the one with the cracked stone steps and the scent of jasmine in the early mornings. Maybe the nuns there would let me sleep in the kitchen or help in the garden. I had nothing to offer but time, hands, and perhaps a story or two for the children they often sheltered. As I walked, I realized that the pain I felt wasn't from the bruise on my cheek, but from the truth I had swallowed like bitter medicine. My usefulness had expired in the eyes of the one I loved most. Not because I had changed, but because the currency of love had become something measurable only in money. But I would not carry shame. I would not die in a house where silence was punishment and food was given with resentment. I would rather walk into the rain, faceless and forgotten, than stay where love had dried up like a well abandoned. I passed the old school, now shuttered at this hour, and imagined the laughter of my students echoing faintly behind the locked gates. That was a time when I was respected, even loved. My voice meant something, my hands built futures. The memory gave me warmth as I continued climbing the winding hill toward the temple. By the time I reached the front gate, my legs were trembling and my clothes were soaked through. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The temple courtyard was dimly lit by a single bulb swinging in the wind. The scent of incense mixed with rain-dampened earth. I stood there hunched, uncertain, until a shadow emerged from the hallway. A kind face, older than mine, nodded silently and gestured me in. I was home again, not the kind with walls and blood ties, but the kind built from compassion and silence that listens without judgment. I would not ask for much, just a corner, a blanket, and the chance to serve again. And so I began again, not as a mother, nor a retired teacher, but as a woman reclaiming her right to be whole without needing to be needed. That night the storm washed me clean, not of pain but of shame. And that, for me, was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The days that followed my arrival at the temple blurred together in a slow, solemn rhythm. I had long forgotten, one that didn't revolve around waiting for an envelope to survive or watching every step I took in my own home. Here I was not someone's burden. I was simply a body breathing, moving, and occasionally offering my hands where they were needed. At first I felt as though I was in exile, not from a land, but from a role I had worn for over 70 years. It's a strange thing, shedding the skin of mother, caregiver, provider. Even when the names had turned into chains, I had worn them tightly, believing they were my only worth. But here, in the hush of incense, smoke, and chanting, I was allowed to be no one, and that was a relief my bones hadn't known they needed. I started helping in the back garden, a tangled patch of soil behind the temple wall, left untended for months. The weeds had claimed the edges, the herbs were overgrown, and some of the vegetables had curled into themselves, trying to grow without attention. I knew how that felt, perhaps that's why I took to it so naturally. I'd always been better with things that didn't speak, plants, pages, silent children too shy to raise their hands. Each morning, I woke before the sun and swept the moss-covered courtyard under the weight of moonlight. My hands, though stiff, found their way around the old broom with familiar comfort. Then I'd walk barefoot to the garden and begin my quiet labor, loosening soil, pulling weeds, watering roots still clinging to life. There was peace in the soil. It never asked where my pension had gone. It never reminded me of the slap, the silence, the disappointment etched into the walls I had left behind. It responded only to care, and I gave it mine fully. Soon the small garden began to respond. New shoots emerged, green and tender, as if grateful to be remembered. The jasmine bloomed first, just a few white stars on a winding vine, but they smelled of something sacred, like memory and forgiveness braided into one breath. I clipped a few and left them at the foot of the temple statue every morning, a quiet offering. I didn't pray for anything, not even healing. I just sat there after the work was done, my hands caked with mud, and watched the smoke from the incense rise like something weightless. People started to notice me, but not in the invasive way one expects. There was a woman who came to sweep near the main hall. She nodded each morning, but never asked my name. A boy of about 10, likely left at the temple after his parents disappeared, would sometimes hover nearby, watching me water the plants with a look that reminded me of my grandson. I never approached him. I knew better than to rush silent hearts. One afternoon, as I was arranging rows of mint in an old bamboo basket, a gentle breeze moved through the trees. It carried voices, small, laughing ones, from behind the temple where the nuns held lessons for orphans and dropouts. I felt a tug in my chest, an ache both warm and sharp. For so many years, my voice had filled dusty classrooms with numbers and folk tales. I wondered if it still held any value, or if age had rusted it along with the bones that now creaked each time I stood. I didn't ask to help. I simply began placing herbs and clean vegetables near the classroom doorway every few days. I left without a sound before the children emerged. Eventually, they started leaving me drawings in return, crude sketches of flowers, houses, stick figures with gray hair. I kept each one folded neatly in the back of my notebook, where the pages had begun to curl with time. One morning I found a scrap of paper with the words, Ba Ngo letter 1E1I, scribbled in blue crayon, grandmother. It was written by a girl named Lynn, no more than 6, with eyes that carried more history than her little body should ever have known. She had lost both parents to a factory fire. No one claimed her. No one remembered her birthday. I began sitting under the banyan tree during the children's free time, not teaching, not exactly, but reading softly from old books the temple stored in wooden cabinets. Some children came, some didn't. Those who did always returned. Without meaning to, I had become someone again. But it was not the same as before. There was no son to provide for, no house to clean obsessively for fear of complaint. There were only mornings and dirt and children with open eyes. And silence, the good kind. The kind that allowed room to breathe, not suffocate. Still, grief found its way into the cracks. Some nights, I'd lie on the wooden cot the nuns had given me and watch the ceiling shadows twist above. I'd think of my grandson, his small hands reaching for mine, his giggles, the way he used to ask me to tie his shoelaces like a ninja knot. I wondered if he remembered me, if he asked where I'd gone, if Tam lied or said nothing at all. That ache never dulled. It just grew quieter, like a wound sealed beneath too many layers of skin. Sometimes I would catch myself stirring soup in the temple kitchen and imagine him walking through the door, hungry from school, asking if there were mangoes. I'd have to steady my hand. The memories still rose like steam, uninvited and too familiar. One day, while trimming lemongrass near the lotus pond, I found a small mirror buried under the soil. It was old, cracked on one corner and etched with vines along its rim. I cleaned it, and for the first time in weeks I looked at my reflection. What I saw startled me, not because I looked older, though I did, but because I didn't look broken. There were lines, deep ones, and shadows under my eyes, but there was also something else, something stronger than sorrow. It wasn't joy. Joy is loud and bright. This was different. This was stillness, like the pond at dawn, untouched and honest. It dawned on me then. I had begun to belong to myself again. Not as someone's mother or grandmother, not as a retired teacher or a name on a pension list, but simply as a woman whose worth did not disappear with her money. I started keeping a journal again, not about the past, but about what I saw each day, the color of the sky at 5 a.m. The way the chilies curled toward the sun, the crooked smile of a boy who finally learned to write his name. These became my riches. I no longer marked time by pensions or the creaking of the house. I marked it by seeds planted, books read, smiles returned. Still, I never spoke about why I came to the temple. The nuns never asked. It was understood here. People arrive at the gates with burdens too heavy for language. We offer no interrogations, only tea, chores, and room to recover. One evening, as I watched the children play, Lynn climbed onto my lap without a word. She tucked her head against my chest and fell asleep. I didn't move. I just held her, rocked gently, and stared into the fading sun. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I did not feel empty. Not forgotten, not discarded, but enough. And perhaps in the quiet behind the temple, with nothing to my name but the stories I carried and the hands that still worked, perhaps I was beginning again. The transition from being forgotten to becoming something like necessary again is slow, gentle even, like how fog dissolves when the sun insists. It does not rush, it doesn't announce itself, but one morning you find that your hands reach for the broom not out of habit, but purpose. You stir the pot not because someone demands it, but because the scent of simmering broth reminds you that nourishment is still a gift. At the temple, time passed without urgency. Days were no longer marked by deadlines or expectations, but by the cycle of small things, chopping herbs, watering young plants, washing bowls still warm from rice. The days folded into one another quietly, like silk scarves stacked in a drawer no one locks anymore. The nuns never asked for more than I could give. They seemed to understand something about old women that the world so often forgets. We are not empty vessels once the giving is done. We are rivers, still flowing, only slower, only quieter. I began spending more time in the stove house behind the main kitchen, a place often neglected because it was filled with soot and creaking walls. But I found comfort in its stillness. The stove there was ancient, built from brick and stone, with an iron door that groaned like an old friend when opened. I would sit beside it, feeding wood into its belly, letting the fire warm my knees, my palms, the hollowness I still carried beneath my ribs. Something about tending fire steadied me. Perhaps it was the rhythm of it, choosing the wood, breaking it down, placing it just right, watching the flame take hold. A kind of dance between control and surrender, like motherhood once was, like survival always is. It became a small ritual, mine alone. Every evening after the last bell and before the final prayers, I would retreat to the stove house. I'd light the fire, boil water for tea, and watch the embers shift color. Red, gold, fading gray. One evening, as I brushed ashes from the hearth, I remembered the kitchen of my old home, how I once used to make sweet rice cakes for my grandson when he lost a tooth or came home with scraped knees. He always asked for the ones with mung bean filling, warm and sticky, wrapped in banana leaves. I could hear his voice in my mind, so vivid it felt like breath on my cheek. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the wind pass through the bamboo, thinking about how memory is never merciful. It returns not when you're ready, but when you've started to heal, as if to test the strength of the scar. There was a small storage shed near the back wall of the temple, where they kept old banana leaves for compost. The next morning I went there early before anyone else had stirred. I took a few, washed them carefully, dried them in the sun. Then I gathered glutinous rice, mashed beans, and sugar. My fingers were slower now, the motions less precise, but the memory of the recipe lived deep in my bones. By afternoon, the stove house was filled with steam and the smell of something nearly forgotten. I worked silently, wrapping, tying, steaming. I didn't make many, just enough. Enough for the children who sat with me beneath the banyan tree, for the boy who now called me Ba, for Lynn who drew me flowers with 6 petals and crooked stems. When I passed the cakes out later that day, I expected little. But the look on their faces, that wide-eyed wonder, the way their teeth sank into the warm filling as if tasting safety itself, it pulled something from me. I turned away before the tears came. There is an ache, soft and burning, when you realize that the care you once gave in vain now finds a home in strangers. Children who do not share your blood, but cling to your presence as if you were born to hold them. After that, the stove house became more than a place of warmth. It became a space of memory-making. I began writing down recipes in my notebook, things I once made for my son, for my husband long before he passed, for my students on holidays. They poured out of me like water, finally finding its stream. In the margins, I started to write pieces of my life, not as confession, not even for remembering, but simply because I had lived, and someone, even if it was only these pages, should know it. There was a story I hadn't told in decades, about the time my husband gifted me a pair of embroidered shoes for our anniversary, even though he'd gone 3 months without work. He had traded a watch for them. I wore them once, then hid them so they wouldn't get scuffed. They were buried somewhere in a drawer when he died. I never wore them again, In writing it down, I cried, not because of the shoes, but because someone had once loved me like that. I realized then that the forgetting hadn't begun with my son. It had begun with me years ago when I stopped believing that my stories had weight, that my memories mattered, when I started existing solely in service to others. At the temple, I began reading these entries to the children, not as sermons, not even as lessons, just as tales from a life lived quietly. I told them about a boy who once brought home a wounded bird and fed it rice until it flew again. I told them about a girl who braided her mother's hair every Sunday afternoon without being asked. They listened not as if I were old, but as if I were eternal. And maybe I was. Maybe all old women are living libraries the world forgets to visit. Seasons began to shift. The air turned crisper, the leaves bronzed and curled. At night, I pulled my cardigan tighter, but inside something opened. I no longer avoided my reflection. I stopped flinching when I heard footsteps behind me. The bruises on my body had faded. The ones in my spirit were starting to dissolve. One morning, I woke to find a bundle left at my door. Inside was a scarf, handwoven with threads dyed from turmeric and indigo. There was no note, just a child's drawing tied around it with string. It was me beside a stove with hearts floating above my head. I pressed the drawing to my chest and wept for a long, quiet time. Not out of sadness, but because I had survived. I was not sure yet what the future held. I didn't need to know. I no longer feared being unseen. I no longer believed my worth was tethered to an envelope or a family name. The fire I tended each night had changed me. It burned away the parts of me that had accepted silence as fate. It warmed the parts I thought were long dead. I began saving the ashes in a small clay jar. I didn't know why. Maybe one day I would mix them into the soil of a new garden. Or scatter them under a tree where children played. Or perhaps I would take them with me, wherever I went next, as proof that I had once built warmth from nothing again and again. In the quiet hours between dusk and dark, I sometimes looked out beyond the temple walls, where the road dipped and vanished into the forest. I wondered if my son ever walked that road, if he missed the meals, the stories, the scent of banana leaves on steamed rice. But I never allowed the wondering to stay long. I had learned, finally, that the past is not a place to return to. It is a lesson to plant, to water, and to leave behind. And so I returned to the stove, fed it one more log, and sat in its glow. An old woman not waiting to be remembered, but simply remembering herself. Some wounds are loud, they scream through the bones and leave marks where skin gives way. But others live quietly, like mold growing in the hidden corners of the soul. I had long learned to live with the quiet kind. But even in the gentle routines of the temple, even amid the laughter of children and the fragrance of boiled tea leaves, the silence from my son remained like a distant thunder, far away but never absent. It rolled through my nights when I laid on the wooden cot, eyes open, heart reluctant to hope. It whispered into my mornings as I watched the mist lifting from the earth, wondering if he had thought of me, even once. There is a difference between moving on and leaving behind. The world often confuses the two. I had tried to leave the memory of that final night behind, had buried it in the soil with the seeds I planted and the incense I lit. But the truth is, memories do not die when you bury them. They grow roots, and some nights they bloom when you least expect it. It happened one late afternoon, just before the rain. The sky was a strange color, dusty orange pressed into gray, and the temple courtyard smelled of wet bark and drifted smoke. I had just returned from the garden when I saw a small group of visitors at the main gate. Nothing unusual. People often came to light incense, seek counsel, or donate rice for the orphans. But something caught in my throat as my eyes landed on a child near the back of the group. He was no more than 6, dark-haired, pale, holding a red plastic car in his hand. And though the years had passed, and his cheeks had grown fuller, I knew. It was my grandson. I froze beneath the archway, the wind pulling at the hem of my cardigan, the air suddenly heavier than all the stone Buddha statues lining the path. He did not see me, or if he did, he did not know me. Children forget quickly. Time robs them gently, replacing faces with shadows and names with silence. Beside him stood a woman I didn't know. Perhaps she was his teacher, a nun, or a caretaker. Perhaps she was someone paid to smile when he smiled, someone told to bring him to places like this to remind him how to be still. But not his father. Not my son. He was not there. I stepped back, hiding behind one of the wooden pillars, breath shallow. I couldn't move forward, couldn't reveal myself. I didn't even know why. Maybe because I wasn't ready to be seen by him again, not without apology, not without the weight of that night acknowledged. Or maybe, more honestly, I feared being recognized and rejected. Again. That evening I didn't light the stove. I didn't touch my journal. I simply sat beneath the old tamarind tree behind the kitchen and let the memories come as they wished. I remembered the last time I held my grandson, how he buried his face into the folds of my neck, his small hands sticky from jackfruit. I remembered how he used to call me Nai in a voice, so high I thought the birds would mistake it for their own. I remembered the drawings he gave me, circles that were suns, squiggles that were rivers, stick figures with curly gray hair. They were all gone now, left behind in a home that was never truly mine. And that's when I began to write a letter. Not to him, the boy, but to his father, my son. The one who used to sit on my lap while I marked papers. The one who cried into my shirt the day his father died. The one who once promised he'd build me a house with a yellow roof, so you can always find your way home. I wrote with the same care I used to teach cursive to my students, slow and deliberate, each word carrying weight I had not touched in years. I told him not of pain, but of absence. I did not describe the bruise or the slap or the silence. I described the sound of his child's laughter in the temple courtyard. I told him about the garden, about the stove, about how peace is not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of your own quiet company. I told him I had forgiven him, not because he had asked, but because I could no longer afford to carry him in my bones like grief. I told him that I once gave him everything, not just money or meals or a roof, but my time, my body, my name. And I asked him only this, to raise his son without fists, without shame. To let the boy grow in light, even if the shadow of what happened to me still lingered on their walls. When I finished the letter, my hands trembled. The ink had bled slightly where my tears had fallen, but the words remained legible. I folded it carefully, wrapped it in a dry lotus leaf, and tied it with a red thread. But I never sent it. Instead, I placed it under a smooth stone in the garden beside the oldest jasmine bush. Let the earth keep it, I thought. Let it be a prayer unspoken but still heard. In the days that followed, something shifted in me. I did not harden nor did I break. I simply changed direction. Like a river rerouted by landslide, not stopped, only altered. I began teaching the older children in the temple, not just to read or write, but to listen, to their own hearts, to the wind, to the pain of others. I told them that silence can be a language, but it should never be the only one. We sat in circles beneath the banyan tree. We wrote our names in the sand. We whispered dreams into the sleeves of our shirts. I asked them to write letters, too, not to their families, but to themselves. Letters they would open when they were old, when they had forgotten their own softness. And I began slowly to feel whole again. Not because I had returned to the woman I once was, but because I had chosen who to become next. There was a clarity that comes only with surviving what you thought would destroy you, a gentleness that only grows after violence, a grace that arrives when no one is watching, when you are sweeping a floor or tying your shoes or brushing a child's hair and realize, suddenly, and without fanfare, that you are no longer waiting for someone to say sorry. That night I lit the stove again. The fire caught quickly, its flames dancing like children released into open fields. I brewed tea with ginger and mint and sat quietly in the warmth, the letter still buried, the boy still out there, my name still unsaid. And yet I was not empty. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like I belonged to the world again. Not because it had made room for me, but because I had stopped asking for permission to exist within it. There are different kinds of love in this world. Some are loud and bursting with declarations. Others are soft as a whisper, stitched into the folds of everyday life. I've come to believe the quiet ones are the truest. The ones that linger in the silence after everyone else has spoken. The ones that survive disappointment, aging, and absence. At the temple, my life had unfolded into quiet routines. I no longer waited for recognition. I no longer sought redemption from those who had forgotten me. I had built a new rhythm, one of gardens, children's laughter, boiling tea leaves, and the comforting scent of old wood. But then the boy began returning. My grandson. The first few times it was with the nuns. He came for prayer sessions or community events, holding onto the edge of a saffron robe or carrying a small satchel of donated rice. He didn't seem to remember me, not fully, but children remember in other ways, through smells, through the way someone hands them food, through the softness of a hand on their back. Memory is not always verbal. Sometimes it's a feeling that clings like dust to skin. He started lingering longer after each visit, wandering into the garden where I worked, watching how I stirred the compost, how I trimmed the dead leaves, how I whispered gently to the flowers before pulling them up. He never said anything, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. One morning, I found him sitting cross-legged by the stove house, waiting. He looked up as I approached and held out a single mango, still slightly green, its skin dappled with dirt and the scent of adventure. I took it in my hands, and without a word began peeling it with the small knife I always kept tucked in my apron. We sat side by side and ate the mango in slices, our fingers sticky, the juice dripping onto our knees. And when it was done, he looked up at me and smiled. That was the first time I allowed myself to hope. Not for reconciliation, not even for restoration, but for the possibility that love, once planted, might find its way back, even if it arrived wearing different clothes and speaking a language made only of glances and gestures. From that day forward, he came often, sometimes with his father, sometimes with books or small drawings he had made, sometimes with nothing at all. And each time I greeted him not with arms open wide, but with simple presence. I showed him how to wash herbs. I let him stir the rice as it cooked. I held his hand when we crossed the slippery stones behind the temple, where the frogs hid beneath fallen leaves. We said little, but love does not always need narration. One afternoon, as we were sitting beneath the banyan tree, he took my hand and began tracing the veins with his finger, slowly, carefully, as if reading a map of stories no one had told him yet. And I knew in that moment he remembered something. Perhaps not clearly, perhaps not in words, but in the quiet places where love first took root. That night I returned to my journal and wrote something I had never dared put to paper. Perhaps I am still needed, not in the way I once was, but in the way a lighthouse is needed by a ship that never docks, but still steers by its light. I cried afterward, not from sadness, but from release. A few days later, his father returned. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply arrived at dusk, holding a tattered folder in his hands. We sat by the stove. I poured tea. He placed the folder on the floor between us. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by him to me, never sent. Some were angry rants scrawled in broken lines about pressure, failure, guilt. Others were pleading, apologetic, confused. Pages of confessions, admissions, prayers written with a child's desperation in an adult's script. I read none of them. I did not need to. He was here, that was enough. I closed the folder, slid it gently back toward him, and placed my hand on top, just once. That touch said everything. And that night, for the first time in years, he sat beside me as I stirred the soup, not as a son seeking approval, not as a child in need, but as a man who had cracked open his own past and survived the sharp edges. Over the next weeks, the three of us, me, my son, and my grandson, began to carve out something new. Not a family in the way people imagine in photographs or ceremonies, but a small triad of effort, forgiveness, and quiet trust. We planted lemongrass together. We painted the fence at the back of the temple. We taught my grandson how to catch tadpoles and how to write his name in soft dirt. They began calling me Bar again, not just out of duty but affection. One morning my son arrived earlier than usual. He had a notebook with him, blank pages, crisp and white. He handed it to me without ceremony. I opened the first page. At the top, in careful lettering, it read, "Things my mother taught me." And below it, a date. No introduction, no apology, just a beginning. That afternoon, we sat under the banyan tree and began to write. Not a story of the past. Not the pain. Not the departure. But small things. How to prepare mung bean paste. How to walk barefoot in the garden without disturbing the roots. How to recognize when water is just hot enough for tea without boiling over. He wrote, I dictated. My grandson doodled in the corners. It was a book no one would publish, no one would read. But it would live on their shelves. And maybe one day it would be passed on again. That night I lit a single candle in the main hall and sat alone. I thought about everything I had lost, my youth, my health, my home. But I also thought about everything I had gained. Peace, clarity, the ability to love again, even when the first version of love had broken me. As the flame flickered, I whispered not a prayer, but a promise. To keep showing up. To keep choosing softness. To never forget that even when we are discarded, even when we are bruised, there is always some small part of us that can be reclaimed. Replanted. Allowed to bloom. Even in the late autumn of our lives. They say you notice change most on quiet days, not during storms, not at the height of festivals or funerals, but in those ordinary moments when the world moves without spectacle. I remember it well. The wind that morning carried the scent of wet earth and dried bamboo, and the jasmine in the corner of the garden had bloomed as if it had waited specifically for that sunrise. The temple bell had not yet rung. The children were still curled in their mats, the younger nuns whispering chants softly in the front hall. I had risen early, as always, sweeping fallen leaves and heating water for the morning tea. My joints were stiff, but I had grown used to the ache. It had become like a gentle tapping from within, reminding me I was still here, still in motion. I moved through the garden, checking the beds of mint and morning glory, plucking snails from the edges, brushing off dead leaves. It was a ritual now, one that tethered me to the present, one that filled the hollow parts of my heart with something useful. Then I saw him. Not the boy. The man. My son. He stood just beyond the temple gate, holding his own son by the hand. It was as if the air had thickened, like a dream pressing against my chest, trying to choke out the sense that this was real. He looked older, much older than he should have. His hair had thinned near the temples. His shirt, though clean, hung from his shoulders as if he'd lost something weightier than flesh. He looked not like a man proud of his place in the world, but one trying to find a place to stand. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I simply watched. And then slowly, they began to walk toward me. My grandson's face lit with recognition, not from memory perhaps, but from the softness that children sense when they are near something safe. He ran ahead, stopped a few paces away, stared. I knelt, and when he came into my arms, it was not with a scream or a sob or a question. It was quiet, a child sinking into something that felt familiar even if he could not explain why. My son approached behind him, his steps were unsure, as if the very ground beneath him might reject him. His eyes met mine, tired, worn, hollowed. I saw in them a shadow of the boy he once was, the one who brought me flowers made of crumpled paper and stood proudly beside me at the school gate. But I said nothing. And he said nothing. Words, I realized then, are not always necessary for truth. Sometimes pain, when carried long enough, becomes its own language, spoken not with the tongue but with the weight of lowered shoulders and the trembling of hands held out in silence. I brought them to the stove house. I lit the fire with shaking fingers and boiled water. I poured tea into 2 cups and placed them on the table. My grandson sat beside me, watching, as if memorizing a ceremony he somehow already knew. My son remained standing, then quietly he knelt. He did not bow. He did not weep, but he placed his hand on the ground and left it there, palm open, as if placing something down, something heavy, something long carried and never once shared. Still, I said nothing. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But because there are moments in life that demand silence, Not the silence of shame, but the silence of reverence. And this was one of them. We sat like that for a long while. The fire crackled. The wind outside rattled the wooden windows. Somewhere in the main hall a bell rang. A new day had begun. Later we walked through the garden. He pointed at the flowers I had planted. At the herbs, he asked nothing. But he looked carefully, as if cataloging each life that had grown in his absence. He did not ask for forgiveness, and I did not offer it, because some things I had come to learn are not exchanged in words. They are rebuilt. In time, in presence, in the quiet labor of showing up again and again. When they left that day, he bowed, not low, not ceremonial, but enough. Enough for me to understand that he had returned not as the man who sent me away, but as someone different. Someone still wounded, still learning, but willing to try. He returned again a week later. This time with tools. He asked to help repair the old fence that bordered the western edge of the garden. The wood had rotted. The vines had overtaken the lower posts. I had meant to do it for months, but never found the strength. So we worked side by side in the afternoon heat, his hands blistering from the unfamiliar labor. My grandson watched, carrying nails in a tin can, smiling when the hammer missed and his father cursed under breath. We spoke little, but I watched how he moved, slow, deliberate, careful, as if each strike of the hammer was an apology he could not shape with language. He came again and again. Sometimes just to sit beside the stove, sometimes to bring fruit or food or a drawing his son had made, sometimes to say nothing at all. And each time I let him in. Not into my home, because I no longer had one, but into my presence, into the space between what was broken and what might still be mended. The temple never asked questions. They never interfered. They only widened their space to make room for a reunion that came not with trumpets, but with bare feet and calloused palms and teacups shared without ceremony. Months passed. Seasons turned. And one day, as the jasmine bloomed again in the corner of the garden, he brought me something I never expected. A small wooden box. Inside was a faded photograph of me, him, and his father, taken when he was no older than 5. I had forgotten it existed. My hair was still black then. My smile wide, his hand clutching mine with a confidence only a child can possess. Beside it was the letter I had written and buried months ago, its edges worn, the red thread still tied. He had found it, and though he said nothing, I saw it in his eyes. He had read every word. That evening, we sat beneath the tamarind tree. My grandson curled beside me, asleep, the scent of the stove's fire still clinging to our clothes. And I thought about what it meant to survive. Not just the night I walked away, but the years that followed. The days of doubt. The mornings of quiet labor. The forgiveness I had offered myself when the world would not. I had not been healed by apology, nor rescued by reunion. I had been rebuilt quietly, gently, by small acts of courage. The courage to keep planting, to keep showing up, to let go without bitterness, to love without guarantee of return. And now, as the stars blinked awake above the temple roof, I felt something settle in me. A stillness. A home, not one made of walls or names or promises, but one made within myself. And for the first time, I did not feel like a woman who had been cast out. I felt like a woman who had come back to herself. Completely, finally, and with no need to be seen, because she now saw herself.